Stop Now, a social experiment enterprise.
Hello there, I'm Melissa, and we're back for this week's talk show.
Well, this is my co-host, Nate.
Nate, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Kevin. Good to talk to you, brother. Happy New Year, man.
Thank you, man. Happy New Year to you as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Been waiting to talk to you, man. Been excited for this episode.
He definitely has.
And not to maybe retread anything that you and Melissa have talked about, but kind of that idea of trauma. And this is something that Melissa and I talked about with our panel last week. Just kind of the idea that there's I think when people think about that word trauma, they think about one big thing that happened to somebody. When the fact is you can go through little traumas every day.
Oh man.
And I think
is trauma.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think in the Black community, there's a lot of these traumas that have accumulated that we don't really talk about, and especially with our young men, it comes out in unhealthy ways.
Yeah, and then we don't talk about transgenerational trauma. I still got my trauma from my mom, and then she from her mom. Then so this transgeneration all the way back to slavery has been transferred down to us because in African American communities we've been taught not to talk about our pain, and so what you don't talk about, you transfer, right? So I think a lot of people don't understand that we're still hurting from that particular pain. And one of the things that I really get in trouble for, because I said I talk to churches a lot, churches teach us how to cope with pain, but not to heal from it, right? Because healing involves confrontation and not just, assimilation. We've been taught to adapt and adopt, right? And not to overcome. And so I think that's one of the big things that we're going to have to do as communities is learn how to confront our issues and pain, and then we can heal from it.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, because I came up in the church, and yes, I think a lot of that mentality, and I'm not saying the church is bad or anything, but I think a lot of that mentality is, you just keep on keeping on.
That's it.
And it's we get so trained to fight through everything, but at the same time, if we don't deal with all this stuff, it's not going anywhere. It's still with us.
We're just going to keep transferring from one generation to another one. I tell people the best way to get rid of a ghost is to listen to it, right? The reason ghosts are ghosts is because they want to be heard. And so because we can't see them, they have to do what they can to make themselves known. And oftentimes that comes through, if they can't do it subtly, they get violent and more violent and more violent. So that's what trauma does. When you ignore it, it comes out in ways that, okay, you won't have to pay attention to this one way or the other. And so you may not be able to see it per se, per the eye, but if you learn how to understand and have empathy and sympathy towards the pain that we suffer through as a race, as a community, then you can hear the pain. You can hear it, and you can hear it in our relationships. You can hear it in the violent crime rates that would be. And I was telling Melissa before you got on, we are good at victim blaming, right? We're good at blaming the victim and not helping the victim. And so we have to get away from that. Right. So, and one of the things we tell people, we're born sinners. And the truth is, we're not born sinners. We're born into a world that was created to sin against us. And so this whole self-blaming, and we come into the world with this idea that we're flawed in some way. And so that has to change. Right.
I don't want to cut you off, but let us introduce our other guest, Elizabeth Vera. Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
She's our domestic violence expert consultant. Yes, thank you so much. Yes.
Sorry. So good morning. Thank you for such an incredible opportunity to be part of a collaboration that contributes to uplifting all our communities. And to be able to have a panel with such distinct and passionate individuals about how to improve the quality of life for those of us who live in those communities and serve those communities. And so let me tell you a little bit about myself really quick. I'm Elizabeth Vera, and I am a domestic violence expert. I have been in the domestic violence field for 28 years now, and have had the wonderful opportunity to have been mentored by some of the most incredible pioneers in the domestic violence movement out of Los Angeles.
Conversation when we started talking, I just wanted to just get into it. I never really got to, have an introduction for you. So can you please, have a formal introduction for you as well?
Okay, my name is Kevin McMillan. I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee. I spent most of my life being a police officer, 20 years. 12 of those years, special victim detective, investigating domestic violence, sex crimes, child abuse crimes, human trafficking crimes. So how law enforcement wasn't really trying to stop abuse. They really was just responding to it. And I saw, law enforcement is not really trying to stop abuse. They just respond to it. They're a responding entity. And so there's no prevention side to it. There's always wait till it happened, then we'll respond when it happened. But me knowing my history, my experiences, I knew that was too late. That once trauma affected a person's life, it stayed with them for life. So they told me that I couldn't do both. I couldn't lock people up and advocate for victims. So I gave away my gun and badge and I resigned in 2017. It's like, I'm tired of being on this treadmill, putting people in jail when I feel like I can do more to help people free people to be in jail. If anything, was the decisions they were making. It was a response to trauma, not that trauma was a bad thing. It was what the body does. It's just that most people are not trained to respond to it well. And so we were punishing people for being traumatized and making bad decisions. So, so I went into the whole speaking, teaching thing,
And that's a really good point. Do you think that there will ever be a time that the police will start to incorporate that? Like you look on TV and you see how they tend to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate the situation. They need to start putting in training how they train the police officers to calm things down rather than to, start killing us, right? Hype things up.
I think that's going to have to be a training, but I also think it's going to be a restructuring of policing. I think you're going to have a community policing and then a responsive police agency, the responsive ones for the violent crime that you're going to have to use force. And then those other police officers who don't have the guns, who don't come with them, the militarized machines and vehicles, and those who can actually sit down and have a conversation, and that's their job. Right? They don't respond when something happens. They're present just to say hello, just to speak, just to go to the parks and watch kids play basketball. We got to change this whole structuring of how we police our communities, and the communities will feel more safer becoming their own policing agencies and doing what's necessary to keep their own neighborhoods protected and clean, because they feel like they're in control of it and not being forced to obey rules that apply to some and not to everybody. So that's going to have to change.
Absolutely.
But they don't want to change it because they fear that, we don't know what we're doing or we don't know what we're talking about. But I tell people I was a police officer for 20 years and I've never solved a crime without the community ever, So the community is a big part of that.
With your organization that you have right now, how are you reaching out to your community right now? Are you out here on social media? Are you going out in the streets right now? Are you working with young people? Please let us know how we're able to get out in contact with you.
Right now, I'm in the process of rebranding myself, because at first, I transitioned from being a police officer detective to now speaking to agencies and those same, trying to transform and reform those agencies to do better when it comes to investigating cases and providing services for victims and communities of color. But now I'm rebranding myself to reach back out to empower the community as well. So now I write books, I do blogs, websites, and so videos that I'm beginning to release, talking about we must understand the nature of trauma. We must understand, particularly from the African-American communities, how we've adopted a slave master's mentality when it comes to disciplining our children, which is a very traumatizing way. Basically, slave master says, do what I say or I'll beat the hell out you. And so as coming up as a young Black boy, my parenting, they just adopted what they were given. And a lot of it was to protect their children, because slaves wanted their children to be protected when they went out to the world. And if it was a colored person or Black person was acting what you would call with pride or uppity, it would cost them a lot. They'd rather discipline them in the house, right?
Get them back in line.
To get in line in the house when they went outside. So it was a protective measure. But I'm trying to revamp and show the public and how that can be damaging to our brain development, how children, that can be dangerous to, children's perception of themselves. And so, that's what I'm doing now, trying to go to military, even from military organizations to churches and wherever I'm accepted, to explain to people, boys do cry. It's just that they cry differently. And if you don't give them culture and space to cry in a healthy way, they'll learn to cry in destructive ways. So that's what I'm doing right now.
I had like 3 or 4 rows of questions that I've been waiting to talk to you about, brother. And one of them is, kind of giving your background, in the law enforcement field, being a detective and going through, seeing so many things over the course of your career. Like when we look back at 2020, one of the biggest stories was kind of the relationship between Black folks and the police.
Yeah.
And we talked George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all those names. Where do you think we can go, in terms of healing that divide between Black people and law enforcement?
Well, we must understand our history. This is not the first time this has happened. Police in the African-American community have always been at odds with each other, and it hasn't been our fault. It's been the perception of Black people and how they confront us and not understanding us. And I was telling Melissa this, that, police departments are really not set up to heal or to combat crime. They respond to it. They wait for it to happen. They come in to respond to and punish whoever may have committed the crimes. They're not trying to go in and heal communities and teach communities and connect with them. That's just not what police departments are trying to do. They may give that facade that that's what they're trying to do. The whole protect and serve. And I always give people this idea that some communities are policed and some communities are protected, right? And you can imagine which ones are policed, right? So even as a police officer, we did roadblocks. And I got in trouble for asking questions like, wait a minute, why are we always doing roadblocks in the hood? Like other people don't break the law, And so I was just told to be quiet and do what I was doing, And the danger with that is that if you get a guy like me who see this job as an only way of income, you start putting on blinders, right? You start doing what they say, right? And then, you may be angry about it, but you're saying, I gotta eat. But the reality is that you're part of that mechanism that's continuing this whole process of them and us. And so what we're seeing, what we saw in 2020 was this confrontation, and saw that, hey, wait a minute, something needs to be done. And so now we're trying to make the police do the change, but they're not going to do the change because they don't see that they need to be changed. The change is going to have to come from the community. The community is going to have to be the ones who say, you know what, we're going to hold you accountable for you police in our communities, just like you police in other communities, right? And so we need to talk to the police chiefs. We need to see, what is your crime? What are you doing about this? What are you doing about that, right? Our children don't need to see the police when they come in our neighborhood with their handcuffs out. Can we see the police just standing around talking to our children as anybody, right? The only time we see police is when they come to take somebody or they come to enforce the law.
What I do right now is I serve as a consultant for developing domestic violence programs. So in 2007, I actually developed the very first batterers treatment program for gang members and gang affiliated individuals in Los Angeles. And this happened at Homeboy Industries. And so it was just an incredible opportunity, because at that point in 2007, I had stepped away from the field a while. And from my experience working with female and male offenders in my treatment groups, one of the things that really resonated and I really saw as something that needed was that most agencies are very quick to terminate individuals who are gang affiliated or gang impacted or gang associated. And so because most of the time these offenders are coming in, many of them have very previous long documented histories of violent behavior, whether that have been in a relationship or a family dynamic in the streets, what have you. And so any demonstration of their resistance or their vocalization about like not understanding why they were there, like batterers treatment programs are designed in a certain way where it's almost like you have to have some understanding of what it is, because all clients come in and they're so lost. It's like, what am I supposed to do? And there's these rules, like what can you say, what can you not say? And in the batterers treatment movement, every organization functions independently, and they have their own models and theories about how they apply those methods and ideologies to their group. And so one of the things that also stood out is that a lot of my high-risk offenders were terminated quite often because they didn't come to group. They had too many absences. And then what happened is, because they had so many absences, they're violated, right? Whether, because some of them are on parole, some of them are probation, children's service, of course, family court, what have you. And so they would be bench warrants get, they issue bench warrants when you're you're non-compliant to your program without any explanation. And then they can be driving down the street to get groceries and they're arrested, incarcerated. And obviously, previous to now with the whole issue with bail is a lot of clients could not get out of jail to come back to their programs to comply again because they couldn't get out of jail in time and they couldn't call their treatment program and let them know that they're incarcerated. And then if they did get incarcerated, instead of it being acknowledged as a temporary leave, it got counted as a violation. And so then they were immediately terminated from the program. So then that's another violation. And it's just multiple layers. And so the biggest thing on top of that, and there's so many things, is that when we are working with sensitive needs populations, regardless of whether we're talking about juvenile offenders or female or male offenders across the spectrum and anything that has to deal with violence, is that we forget, or social service providers forget who they're working with. It's like they forget the population that they're working with. These are not middle, upper class or communities who have lawyers that can represent them, make calls on their behalf. Many of them are estranged from their families. And even if they're not, one of the policies in batterers treatment programs is the only person who can cancel their program is them. So they have to call into the office and let us know why they can't come in. And so, because the policy is that offenders are responsible for their own actions, right? And then there's the HIPAA compliance where no one else can call for you. So then domestic violence programs hear nothing, and then the client gets exited out, and the comment is no show, no call in, client violated for failed to attend. And then that's a second offense on top of already the other. Wow. And the reason that I'm sharing this is because one of the things that people really don't understand unless you come from these communities or you have been educated or surrounded or empowered, is that working with gang members or gang affiliated or gang impacted communities is safety. Okay, there aren't a lot of projects or organizations that really do the work within those immediate communities. And the ones that can't serve everybody because there are territorial lines. You can't cross one neighborhood and jump on the bus and go to 2-3 neighborhoods away and then walk in like it's nothing and assume right. You're gonna make it to the door and then get in.
Yeah.
So that is, that was something that's always really resonated with me. And I just feel like there hasn't been enough awareness on that. I think that we as the domestic violence field, and like any other field, whether re-entry, juvenile justice, is that we kind of become a little tunnel visioned and we function within our own parameters. And then when we cross-reference, we don't understand how we lost the client. because we get on this high horse about, we get on this high horse about we're doing the services better than they are. And so instead of aligning ourselves with our external support systems and frameworks in our community, all we're really doing is isolating clients at the end.
A domestic violence household. Really didn't know what it was. I knew I didn't like it until I became a police officer, understood the dynamics of it. But at the age of 12, while walking home from a friend's house, I was kidnapped and I was raped by a man that I didn't know. Once he was done raping me, he got on top of me and began to strangle me and tried to murder me. I had to fight him off. I did fight him off. I ran all the way home. And my mom asked me what happened. I told her, and I lied, told her I was robbed because I was a male. I couldn't dare tell anyone that my virginity and my masculinity had been taken from me from a man that I never met before, never knew. And so I, carried that with me for years and years and really didn't tell my story or disclose the story until I was in my late 30s. And I was a police officer with a gun and a badge. And so that's my story and why a police officer, why investigating cases of a little boy. I had a case of a little boy who was molested as well, and I watched him tell his story with such courage, and I watched him transform in front of me as he was telling his story, hearing his story, and us asking information from the kid. And from the child advocate center point of view, they were listening. They weren't trying to tell the kid or trying to extract information or use the kid to get information. They were actually concerned more about the person than they were about what happened to the person. My case, and that just made me a better investigator. I solved 6 serial rape cases here in Atlanta. I solved 5 child murder cases here in Atlanta, and it was all because how I dealt with the family and the victim. Right, I didn't make them feel like they were somebody that something bad happened to. I really became interested in every part of their lives, not just that part. And so that became my passion, and I wanted to incorporate it in our training. Police department told me no. I'll get back in my cubicle, do what I was paid to do. So in 2017, I handed over my gun, my badge, and I started my own company. And I said, if I can't do it from the inside, I do it. And so that's what I do now full time. The 12 Project is an organization I created to educate the world about the effects of trauma and abuse from the victim's perspective and not just from an expert perspective. The listening. My motto is being heard leads to being healed. And so I think that was one of the elements that had been missing that we tell victims and we use victims to get information, but we rarely hear their stories. And it is those stories that brings forth not just justice, but also healing. Because for me, just putting someone in jail is half the justice. You have to bring healing to the family and the victim as well.
Thank you for telling your story, Kevin. And I feel like, that's something that a lot of our viewers, maybe can relate to. And tying what you said back to what Elizabeth was telling us in terms of the system, because I do feel like there's maybe a bit of a barrier for survivors or victims that do want to tell their story, that do want to seek justice, but they don't know where to turn. They don't know where to start. Is there something that the system can do to maybe better assist these people out here who have been hurt?
For me, I think, and one of some of the things I try to get police departments to do is get into the normal. You can come in, instead of you trying to tell them how to run their communities, listen to the problems they bring to you and try to coordinate and cooperate with them and establish a connection to partner with them to help bring some of these things under control, and not just under control, but actually give them and empower them to understand the nature of how we do this as a team and not just as us versus them. Because people, like Elizabeth said, I may want help from the police, but I'm afraid that if I call the police and you pull up to my house in a marked car or walk in my house and come back out, that I'm deemed a snitch. Now I put my whole family in jeopardy, right? Or when I worked domestic violence cases, officers didn't understand. They would threaten to lock the victim up if the victim called again. So now the victim thought, wait, who do I call? This officer, it comes in and they don't see anything because the law said they have to see something to do something. Like, wow, really? And so, you call the police on the person and they come in and they go by the law and don't see nothing and leave. How much jeopardy have you put that person in? And am I going to really call the police again? And one of the things I trained police officers on too, we was in the habit of sending kids to their room. Like, could you tell your kids to go to the room? this adult business and didn't know we were sending away our most powerful witness, right? Because children here, they listen, they're affected by it. And so we were just not trained. And I think we're going to have to invite some of the community folks. It can be pastors, it can be, whoever, into some of our training and train together. So in our training, we get a different perspective, because if I'm in a room full of law enforcement and experts in the field, we're training on what we know. We're not even listening to the perspective of those who we're sent to help, right? And so I think that needs to be something that's incorporated.
If I can just chime in on that part, I completely agree. By the way, I'm a huge fan of the 12 Project. So this is incredible to meet you. So one of the things, and it's totally in line, in Los Angeles about 20 years ago, this concept of community policing had really begun to emerge. And it was like a collaboration with the probation department and law enforcement and sheriffs. And so at one point, community policing was actually a model when it had just been released. And so there was extensive cross-training within disciplines. And then as, the violence exploded and leadership and governmentship changed, there was a shift, and it went from collaboration to a more like, well, we'll consult with them if we think it meets the need. And then it came to, well, really not talking anymore. And then it became us versus them. And how we look at victimization, how do we determine offenders. And California has a lot of interesting laws. And so one of the things that happened in the last 20 years is this concept of, mutual combat, which is a term that is used. And so one of the things that happens is that if law enforcement receives a 911 call and goes to a domestic violence home to respond for the call, the priority in law enforcement is you have to identify who the primary aggressor is. Now, the reason that concept is so dangerous is because it's never crystal clear who the primary aggressor actually is. And sometimes what happens, and again, anything I say is just an observation and not anything negative about how we do our work. We all have to do our work within the parameters of what we've been given. So law enforcement officers are not social workers. They're there to enforce the law. And so I think also that public awareness piece, people need to understand that what everybody's role in limitations are when we do collaborate and respond to these circumstances. And so when they couldn't identify who the primary aggressor was, it was determined to be a case of mutual combat. When that happens, they arrest both. So let me just say, like, typical relationship, is male, father, daughter, father, husband, and kids. So there was, for a very long time, the arrest numbers really went up for both victims who had been experiencing domestic violence episodes and for offenders. And then that means that the kids go fast track into foster care, then they're placed with families. And then the average time, well, here in LA, the average time a DCFS case is open is about 2 years. The first 6 to 8 months are all investigation. Then there's determination whether voluntary family reunifications are going to be offered. Clients have to enter treatment. They have to graduate from these programs, or we say, okay, if you go to counseling for a year, you're going to be a great dad now. But we know that not to be true, because we see all these incidents of child and infant mortality after children have been separated from their parents for extended amounts of time. In LA, we saw multiple cases, and it happens everywhere, but it just doesn't always get the light. It doesn't always get the light that people need to see. And when it does, it's so dramatic that it's undigestible to the lay community, because the concepts, like you're saying, they're so complex. I mean, domestic violence, any type of abuse or trauma, the reason that it's difficult is because it doesn't make sense. So as our brain works is that, well, 1 + 1 is 2. So I don't understand how 1 + 2 is 20. And so what happens is then when our communities do see these cases get the media attention, they're like, well, how could that happen? In my mind, because I'm really dark and sarcastic, it happens all the time. You know, infant mortality rates are at the highest between 0 to 12 months. That is the most dangerous time for a child, and that's when they're most likely. And then from there on, it's up to 5. And so as we move forward, sometimes when we are working with families, you know, it is really difficult for us to communicate as advocates and treatment providers that we appreciate their situation. And it's really hard because there isn't a real word. Because when I was a DART responder to a domestic abuse response team member, and I'm trained in sexual assault response team as well. So I've gone out on the police calls and have you. And I agree is that particularly in communities of color, you know, we can smell them a mile away, like we know. And we are, as a culture, are so institutionalized into this sense of fear that we either as victims, as witnesses, or as offenders don't genuinely disclose all the details that do merit the attention that could determine a more logical, practical direction for intervention. What intervention services are going to work.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, and it's just right off what you're commenting, is really training. A couple of weeks ago, I just wrapped up a project with an agency that does law enforcement trainings. But what was really unique about this and this project was it was using VR technology. So what it is that law enforcement officers obviously go through a certain amount of training, but they're not experts. And we are all human beings. So whether we know it or not, we do project our own ideologies into the situation. Like to say, well, I'm completely detached. No, you're not, because the fact that you said detached means you're not. It's all semantics. And so this training was really developed. There were multiple scenarios that we worked on, and there's 3 endings that the officers, based on their decisions, do. And so the training is a virtual reality. So they actually put the VR goggles and the multiple scenarios play out. There's an ending where it's a fatality, and then there's an ending with a more positive intervention. Because I think the other thing, and it would be great, is I've not always been, honestly, let me just say I've learned to be a better communicator in what I say and the words I use. But I learned that by attacking law enforcement or criticizing them, and a lot of organizations take that, well, you know, this attitude, that it just really is so damaging to the field, to the community, to the way that victims will respond, because then they'll say, well, my therapist said you guys did it all wrong. And then where there could have been a collaboration on something, there's no opportunity. It's been extinguished. And so anyways, going back to training, so the training officers get to determine what the outcome is, which is really interesting, because a big part of it was the development of the scenario, because it's how do we introduce the concept of empathy. And one of the things people don't realize, whether you're working with victims, children, offenders, any of us, is that empathy is a human emotion that is numbed out throughout our lives due to our own experiences of trauma or internal feelings of resentment, victimization, and hurt, right? And so what happens is that when law enforcement goes out, they're not looking at it like, oh my God, we're gonna help this one. They're like, this is, and you know, it's a generalization. There's like, okay, let me get some water because I'm not gonna come back right away. And then there's the couple sides, right? Like, oh, this family again. And what happened now? So they've already started assessing the situation, and they haven't even heard anything, have no details, no information. They don't know if it's a fatality. Like, it's just like, ugh, okay, you know how these calls go. And it's unfortunate. So rather than attack and criticize law enforcement with this project, it was, you know, my idea and what I pushed was the only way to have and create opportunity for law enforcement to develop empathy is that we as professionals or in paraprofessionals, that we extend them the concept of empathy. And so I really made a big point during this project to let everybody know, and you and 12 Project and everybody else on the panel, is that 911 domestic violence calls are the most dangerous calls on top of everything, because they're absolutely unpredictable. And actually 911 domestic violence calls are the largest reason most law enforcement officers are either severely injured or experience fatalities.
So how do you think we can put an end to these abuses? Like, do you see an end to it? Like, we can just completely stop all these types of, you know, these abuses with the children and eventually down the line?
You know, violence, we all like to have these ideologies about how to eliminate racism and sexism and sexual assault. But I think I'm a little bit more of a realist, is that violence is an inherent human feeling. Whether we're angry and throw a bucket or a rock, whether we're angry and decide to lash out or not lash out. And so I really think at the end of the day, what really can change things is really actually acknowledging that we need to align ourselves with the community and with the families. And instead of being so definitive about bad, good, right, wrong, but that we allow ourselves to enter this world of gray, because this is where families live. They're they're not all good or all bad. These things are episodic. And so when we approach something,
sounds like a no.
No, it does. No, and that's what I'm trying to get to. It does, but you know what it does is that, and it's also a requirement as paraprofessionals, that we align each other. And so, like, my final note is we have shown that we can reduce. There is a reduction in violence. There are models and programs that are efficient. There are families who exit the system successfully. There are families that are able to regain their children and no longer become a threat to themselves or others. So all of that happens, and I'm not saying it doesn't, but what I'm saying is the way to make that work is, one of my suggestions has been on all my project is, like with law enforcement, you know, when they do their police reports, they'll say like, no visible injuries, period. And then that's it. But when that case goes to court and the woman shows up with a black eye and other lacerations or cuts, the judge will say, well, there's nothing in the report. Well, that's where cross-training comes in, where we, you know, like I'm working with law enforcement and letting them know that many injuries don't present immediately. You know, some bruises and more severe bruising and injury actually is under the skin and it doesn't emerge. Or you see like hairline fractures in limbs, skull fractures, contusions around the head. And so my suggestion was, instead of saying no visible injuries, it was there are no visible injuries at this moment. Because that changes that one word, where her attorney can say, see, he said at that time, but we know that these injuries will sooner or later manifest itself. That is incredibly empowering, because one, it gives the victim the identification and the support that we know that not everything pops up. And that your injuries, you don't have to lie to us or pretend that we don't have to pretend we don't believe you. We believe you, right? Because we know that bruises take time. And not everybody who has injuries are symptomatic. And so that just one line also allows law enforcement and the judicial system to add additional charges for any other injuries that they sustained, but are only now manifesting themselves. And so I think a lot of it is really language. And that's how we can support each other. And that's how we reduce violence. It's about being able to start identifying more commonalities in how we work with our communities and how we work with each other, than really being more definitive. We need to blur the line when it comes to connecting. And I was a victim of domestic violence. That's how I got into the work, and that's story for another day. But the degree of violence that I experienced and my children experienced was severe. And so the reason that I got into the work is because I just saw how DCFS attacked me, and then law enforcement couldn't get it together, and then my family and my abusive husband. And I just kept thinking to myself at 19, I don't want this to happen to another family. And both of my children sustained lifelong injuries. And so that's why language is so important. And I think it's under-recognized as a tool, but it is a tool. And so working with families, and when we say I appreciate your experience, you better mean it.
Yeah.
Understand. If she's crying, let her cry, instead of writing a patient is incredibly emotional and unstable and failure to protect. No, she's not. The fact she even got to your door makes her compliant, makes her successful. When she gets out of the bed to feed her children whatever it is that she can, that is a good mother. A mother
to keep going.
And so we are in that direction, and I'm really proud to see how much movement and growth is happening, which is so exciting. Like right now, I'm doing homeless intervention services in South Central, and let me see the things that I'm seeing, the degrees of violence, poverty, gang, just to me, the part of South Central that I'm in, it really looks like a refugee camp. Wow. And so I see violence all around and poverty around. And so when we're working with families, it's important to understand that we can give them this book of tools we learned at school, but those tools are not applicable in those communities, right? You can't call the police. If someone calls DCFS, you're more likely to get your children removed.
Right.
If someone gets scared because you look a certain way,
Elizabeth, not to pick you guys. I mean, Kevin also mentioned that, right? So you all go through this and you have that trauma and experience on abuse, and then you decide to do this. So is that like something like only people who got abused have to talk about it and they have to fight for it? Is that how like you see this?
Okay. Yeah, I think when it comes to people who do the work and become very passionate about it, something draws you to the work. I think you're summoned to it, whether you don't realize it or not, and that's one of the ways I get officers and other people to be empathy towards victims, is that everybody, has a story. And particularly, when I talk to officers and talk about how many of them have seen their parents argue and didn't like it, right? And how they feel at that moment that they witnessed this as children. And so they begin to, incorporate their own sense of witnessing some things when they were little, because we forget sometimes when we deem ourselves to be experts, we focus more on, how can we solve the problem rather than how do we understand it. And so I think understanding the problem becomes more of a tool to actually handle and help with the people with their problem than seeing the people as the problem. And so you start dealing with polyvictimization, you start dealing with, complex trauma. Everybody has experienced trauma in some form, some shape or another. And so I think what happens is those who do the work, we forget that we also have been traumatized in ways. And so we see this more as a job, as more than a calling, and more than our our ability and special gifts and talents. We don't see ourselves as gifted and talented, but now we have transformed and transferred our traumas to now become the almost like what I can't think of the helper. We're the hurt helper. We're the ones, who know what it's like, but somehow we forget. And I think that's common in the field.
We all, the minute we are born, we inherit the history of our predecessors. And within our culture, and it's not just within culture, but in culture, there's multiple subcultures and classism and ageism and sexism, and I could go on and on, families with disabilities. And the reality is to really step away from this concept of, wow, that's in their culture, and label it that way. Because for me, I'm Mexican, not all Mexicans are the same. We were all raised the same. And so what I really encourage everyone is to, rather than say, well, that happens a lot in the Latino community, that's really isolating. And what it does when we use that language, it scapegoats the offender, so that the offender can now say, well, it's because I was Black, or it's because I was Mexican, I was poor, I was this. And that language really causes, and that approach actually really creates more distance and more damage, because we do inherit our culture and our language and our education and what have you. What I always emphasize is be an individual, be you, don't be human, just be a human being. And when we can approach each other as mutual human beings outside of what we think we see, but we really don't know, it really shows that we have respect for each other's life. And even within our culture, one of the things that stands out is colorism, particularly like in the Latino community. The more browner you are and darker, the more bad you are and poor. The lighter you are in our culture, the prettier you are, the better you are, you different chances. And so to really, I know that these concepts seem impossible, but some days we're gonna do it right, some days we're not. But to just come from that place. And I think that always being respectful of the communities, and making changes that they can adopt, that are easy. So one of the things that I do is when I work with victims and children, I teach them how to call 911.
Kevin, so like we are running short on time. To piggyback, two questions for you, Kevin, to wrap up. First, going off of what Elizabeth just talked about, kind of that transgenerational trauma, some of those stereotypes out there. Question number one is like, how do we get to that point where we're individuals? Then the second question is, again, going back to something Elizabeth talked about earlier with the way that we interact with the community and law enforcement, and it's not us versus them, but it's everybody working towards a common goal. One of the big things this past year in 2020 was the idea of police reform or defund the police, or some would even go as far as to say abolish the police. Where do you come down on that? So those are two big questions that I'm throwing here at you at the very end.
I think one of the things we have to deal with, culture is a big issue. And I often train 911, investigators and police. If someone calls 911, that's a revolutionary act. That's serious. They may never get a chance to call it again. Particularly when certain cultures, certain cultures is just unheard of that they get the police involved. So understanding culture helps you understand that, wow, we have to understand where these persons are coming from, how they live, what's a norm for them, because a spanking in one community can be deemed abuse from another community standpoint. And so those lines are blurred. And so the law kind of makes it so that, abuse has this definitive meaning. But for me, I think abuse, the word itself is a compound word. The root word is used where we get the word utility from. Utility means purpose, power, and potential. And AB is the prefix. And, anytime you add a prefix from the root word, it changes the meaning of the word. AB means to kill, steal, and to take away. So abuse or abuse means to kill, steal, or take away someone's purpose, power, or potential. And that can be done in any form or fashion. So we need to come up with a definitive definition that we all understand what abuse means. And so as far as the defund the police and transform the police, I think oftentimes what happens, people go to the extremes and say, you know what, let's go to the far end and say, let's get rid of policing altogether. Well, now you got to deal with this element. They're going to keep people who need protection, people who need the law enforced. And so you can't go to that extreme. And I think what happens is what we have to do is sit down and have a conversation as to what we're doing wrong and how can we correct what we're doing wrong and what are we doing right, and let's increase what we're doing right. And so let's get to the place where our goal is to protect and serve and not to punish. And I think oftentimes that becomes the major, we're going to show you by punishing you. Well, even when it comes to me, I told you I work 6 serial rape cases. Oftentimes when I talk to the suspect, I didn't treat them as a suspect. I went after the victim in the suspect. And oftentimes when I went back to that suspect's childhood and asked them, when was the last time a man hugged you? That's when they broke. When I focused on their humanity is when they came out and they say, you know what, I acknowledge that what I did was wrong, but here is why. And so I think one of the things we're going to have to get back to is recognizing each other's humanity. We may have different cultures, but a cry happens in Georgia the same way it does in Africa. It may be for different reasons, and no one teaches a child to cry, right? When a child comes out, who teaches them to cry? We're born with these things. We're created for them. That's what we have to tap into, even as police officers and those who do the work. We're human. You know, sometimes people forget that me and Melissa, we're humans too, right? We do the work, but we go home, we have feelings and so we need to acknowledge that. Like most police departments don't have counselors, and yet they deal with every problem in society every single day. I was a police officer with a loaded gun, and every weekend I drank myself and had suicidal ideations of killing myself because I had my trauma as a child, right? And God forbid. They had
counselors.
Yeah, they don't have counselors, right? They don't have counselors. They don't talk to nobody. In the culture, going back to the culture question, law enforcement and social workers, we even have a culture, right? If you admit that this work is getting to you, they'll put you on the street and say you're not cut out for the work. Mm-hmm. And so I think what happens is healing has become ingrained, not just for the people who are experiencing the victimization on the outside, but also for the law enforcement and those personnel who are actually called to deal with it. And once we see that, because you can't teach a law enforcement officer how to have empathy when you're always teaching them that the world is a dangerous place and they must do everything possible to protect themselves. So instead of using my greatest tool, I go to my most dangerous one, which is my weapon, right? And so I think that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have shows like this more often. We'll have to have conversations.
Definitely.
We'll have to have it in our churches. We're going to have it online. We're going to have to stop talking about, Kanye divorcing Kim and start talking about something that really, really makes a difference in our culture and society. And the last part, and I'll close with this, we have to do it from both ends. We have to change the culture. We live in a violent culture. Listen to the music. You turn on the TV. We live in a culture that celebrates and sometimes rewards violence. And we have to come to the conclusion that we can't say we want one thing and yet want another. So I think
you look at all those people on Wednesday that rushed into the Capitol building, and it's like where did they get those ideas from? It's like it didn't just come from anywhere. Like this is part of America is that violence.
Violence. We are a country of violence. I mean, we hate to say that, but we are. You know, we put more money in militarization and military than we do in families. I mean, it's the truth. And so we're really gonna heal. You got to tell the truth. And so I think that's one of the things that we're trying to skate around. We're trying to pretend that this is not an issue or has not always been an issue. It always has been. And I always tell people human trafficking is not new when I do this. You know, that was a song by 356 Mafia that the Oscars gave an Oscar to for It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp. And then they allowed Queen Latifah, the one who said, who you calling the BITCH, they gave her the honors of presenting the award. How ironic is that? Right? So we're sending mixed messages. We're going to have to be consistent with our messaging.
Yes, I agree. And thank you for that message, brother. And
Yes.
before we wrap things up for this week, definitely we want to thank you as well as Elizabeth for taking time out of your schedule to sit down with us and sit down and talk to the people. So if somebody wants to get in touch with your organization, if somebody wants to further this conversation, we can start with you, Kevin. Like, where can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can reach me on my website, www.the12project.com. That's spelled out. Or I have another website that specifically deals with the healing of men called www.thetraumaking.com. They can reach out on any of those platforms, and I'd be more than happy to have a conversation and reach back out.
Well, thank you so much for that, brother. And Elizabeth, like, again, we thank you so much for your time today. If somebody is in a situation where they're looking to, get some help, where can people find you and maybe start that road to that healing that you were talking about?
Right. So what I do is I don't do direct services. I do consultations now. But I think that there in every state and in every county, there's usually a domestic violence hotline. And the reason that I promote that is because when we're coming from different counties and states and cities, I always feel it's much more incredible and powerful when someone can connect to something that they can identify and see. And that it's accessible, because ultimately I want a victim to feel like they can access the resources, the information when they need it. And those times it's not an 8 to 5 job, that's a 24-hour job. And that's why using local 1-800 numbers are so wonderful. I should have wrote one down because I didn't. But definitely, and one of the great things is that a lot of the domestic violence organizations have escape buttons. And so if someone goes on their laptop or computer or phone and they're trying to research information, there's usually a button in the screen where it says escape. And what it does is these websites have been designed to disappear off history. So if someone touches the computer and clicks, the history of that particular website is not going to show, which is amazing. 2, when you call a hotline, don't feel like you have to leave your partner or it's because you want to call the police. Calling a hotline is very scary. You don't know who's going to answer. And so one of the things I tell my families, these are the hotlines. Call if you feel like you really need to talk and you're in pain, but you don't have to give your name. You don't have to say where you are. And if the person's voice who answers the phone doesn't feel warm and you don't instantly connect, hang up, because that's not the one for you. And then we go to the next one until we find the one that is for you.
You do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks.
Stop Now, a social experiment enterprise. Stop, listen, share. Everyone can make a difference. We are on a mission. Everyone should do something greater in their lifetime. Change the future. Be a proud member. Join us to support, volunteer, and donate.